Examined the war on drugs, and it's been absolutely clear to us that it has failed. It's failed miserably. Now, as a businessman, if I have a business that fails every year for 40 years, I don't carry on running the business. I change course.
I recently visited with a person from Colorado who was from Oklahoma and went to Colorado when the medical movement started up there. And what he told me was that the marijuana movement writ large really began to gain steam when juries began nullifying in marijuana cases. Some of you may not know about the doctrine of jury nullification. You certainly don't get to hear about it in a courtroom anymore. But at the time that our original United States Constitution was drafted, jury nullification was commonplace. Jury nullification is the idea that the jury can disagree with the king's bad law and refuse to enforce it. Regardless of what the evidence is in court, a single juror can keep a bad law from harming people. More people that are of our position need to get on these juries. Don't avoid jury duty. Be grateful that it's come your way and that you're given the opportunity to help vindicate somebody's rights. Yeah. And then in voir dire, that's the process when they're selecting jurors. Don't wave your pro-marijuana flag proudly because the prosecutor is going to kick you off of that jury. Yeah. But once you get on that jury, it is your right as a juror to refuse to convict people of an immoral and unjust law. Yes. Amen. And if ever there was a law that was immoral and unjust, it is cannabis prohibition. What God gave us, no government should be able to take away.
300 billion that goes into the underworld a lot of that can go in tax to governments, which can then be used to get rid of their deficit. It can be used to help with health programs. It can be used to help with education. And so instead of the underworld, misusing that money, governments can use it constructively.
The United States houses more human beings in prisons than any other country in the world. This is true whether you're counting total numbers or in relation to population size. This wasn't always the case. The number of prisoners in the US began to rise dramatically in the 1970s. So what changed in America compared to other countries? While there are several competing theories, a look at the data reveals that a significant part of the prison growth in the last 40 years has been driven by the war on drugs. Here's the data. By 1980, there were over 315,000 prisoners in state and federal facilities. 57% were violent offenders, 30% were property violators such as thieves or those convicted of fraud. 5.5% of inmates were in for public order and other miscellaneous offenses. And the remaining 7.5% were non-violent drug law violators. 10 years later, the drug war had grown, and the total American prison population had more than doubled to over 740,000 inmates. The proportion of offenders in each type of crime had also changed dramatically. The most growth occurred in the non-violent drug offender population, which grew to a significant 24%. And this last statistic actually understates the influence of the drug war on prison populations. Many studies have shown that drug prohibition causes violent crime by leading to the formation of gangs and cartels. And thus it is safe to say that the number of violent criminals under prohibition is higher than it would otherwise be. From 1990 to 2000, the drug-driven population growth continued. By 2000, the total prison population had almost doubled again to over 1.3 million inmates. And by 2010, the prison population was up to 1.6 million people. The growth has started to settle and even decline in recent years, but the proportions of offenses are retaining their post-1990 levels. America's unique methods of enforcing drug prohibition seem to parallel its unique prison population. And one has to ask, is our country really better off with so many non-violent drug offenders behind bars? Are drug users likely to be cured from addiction by being locked up? Has locking up dealers and users lessened the demand for drugs? Certainly, the effects on overall usage could not be called a success. And yet we spend billions every year on this war and lock up hundreds of thousands. Surely there must be a less costly approach to addressing drug use in America.
Prohibition. When I was a teenager, Prohibition was repealed in 1933 when I was 21 years old. So I was a teenager during most of Prohibition. Alcohol was readily available. Bootlegging was common. Any idea that alcohol prohibition was keeping people from drinking was absurd. There were speakeasies all over the place, but more than that. We had this spectacle of Al Capone, of the hijackings, of the gang wars.
People that are supporting the status quo are on the wrong side of history, just like the people that the Billy Sundays and the Anslingers and the rest who supported alcohol prohibition were on the wrong side of history. It's just a question of when. And then I guarantee anyone who will listen that 2 years after we change away from this failed and hopeless policy, everybody will join arms, look back astonished, aghast that we could have perpetuated such a failed system for so long.
To give you a quick example, in 1919, there was a homicide rate in this country. We instituted alcohol prohibition in 1920. The homicide rate in this country climbed every year until it peaked in 1933 when we legalized alcohol. And by 1937, the homicide rate in America was back down to the level it was at before alcohol prohibition started. And I want to point out one other thing about 1937. That was the deepest, darkest period of the Depression in this country. So there was a lot of angry people, but they weren't killing themselves anymore because we took the product away that they were killing themselves over.
Like prohibition, the ban on drugs has been a financial bonanza for organized crime, and its profits have financed the corruption of law enforcement agencies, politicians, and judges.
Never would have gotten prohibition if you hadn't had all the young men away in France when the vote was taken, so that the women had an extraordinary influence on them. But
the first attempt at prohibition that we have any historical record of started with these words: "Do not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil."
Whoa.
It was in the Garden of Eden, and the reason why it didn't work is told you in Genesis, and it's because the Creator, after creating the two people, granted them free will.
When the Crusaders finally succeeded in getting the Prohibition Amendment added to the U.S. Constitution, it was their crowning triumph and the nation's tragedy. Organized crime blossomed. So did the corruption of the whole political process.
Best thing I can do for my country is to help us repeal drug prohibition. It's the most patriotic thing that I'm able to do, and we're going to be successful.